Hello everyone, welcome. Today we're going to talk about setting valve clearances on this RB engine. Let's review what we need to do this job. We're going to need some buckets. These buckets are all standard, one size. You're going to also need some shims here. These are the shims that the customer supplied. The techniques that I'm going to show you in this video are perfect for when you do not have the option to go out and purchase new shims. You just have to use what you're given. So let's see how we will proceed. We have some bounce springs, and these are very light springs that we're going to just use to hold the retainers on top of the valve. The retainer is the home for the shim, so we have to install the entire valve train assembly to keep the retainer and the shim in place while we measure clearance. Of course, a feeler gauge is necessary to measure clearances. We also have this tool to measure the installed valve stem height. This is critical because if we need to adjust how high or low the valve stem install height sits, we need to be able to quantify that exactly. So this is a very important tool. Next we have this fixture that I use to hold the valves in place. I have a jig that the fixture goes onto that allows me to tip the top of the valve stem or grind off small increments from the top of the valve stem. Here you can see how the valves are set in the fixture to allow you to tip the valve. Also, this fixture is set in a jig that holds it perpendicular to the grinding surface, both on the horizontal and vertical axis. So you get a perfect cut. Okay, let's get started. We're going to focus on these two valves. Of course, the valves have been lapped already. There are valve seals installed as well. So I can just push them open with my fingers. First thing we're going to do is to do a vacuum check to make sure that the valves seal properly. This will tell us that the entire head of the valve is resting properly on the valve seat and there's no space. So all our clearances are going to be accurate. Here you can see I'm testing the vacuum gauge. 24 inches of mercury is what is registering on full vacuum when I cover the hole with my finger. So now I have to put the mounting block on the face of the port. This is really hard to do with one hand. I'm going to have to let go of this gauge and hold it on there properly so that they could test the vacuum of that port. And there we have 24 inches of mercury. That's a perfect seal. Now that I know my valves are lapped, when I remove the pressure from the line, the mounting block is just going to fall off of the port. There's no more vacuum will be there to hold it in place. Success. So this is very, very important because when we are measuring valve stem install height, we have to be sure that the valve face sits perfectly on the seat. That way all our measurements will be accurate. Now let's install the rest of the valve train components, the bounce springs, retainers and clips, shims and buckets. then we could see what our baseline clearance is. This is another advantage of using soft or bounce springs, as I call them, because this installation is really easy. You can just use your fingers. Perfect. No special tools required. Okay, now we put in the shims, which are held in place by the retainers, then the buckets and cams. Of course, it's important to note that once I have the cam set in the journals and rotating smoothly, there's absolutely no pressure pushing the cams out of the journals whatsoever. I only have the 2 bounce springs installed under the valves that I'm going to test, so there's no danger or no fear of the cam being lifted out of position while doing the measurement. Of course, we refer to the cam spec sheet to get the clearance that we'll be shooting for. Here we clearly see the intake is at 0.45 millimeters. The exhaust is at 0.38 millimeters. Roughly about 17 thou on the intake and 14 or so on the exhaust. This is not the norm. Usually the exhaust is a larger clearance, but it's what this cam sheet says. So I've selected my feeler gauges that I needed to use, and let's see how much clearance we have. Notice I'm putting my hand below the head on the valve face to make sure the valve doesn't move at all when the gauge is inserted to measure the clearance. Okay, here's a better view using the 16 thou feeler gauge. Usually I'm comfortable with a plus or minus 1 thou on clearance setting. The 16 thou gauge does not fit on that valve. Look how it slides in there on valve number 11. Just a light drag on the gauge as it's under the fat part of the lobe. That is perfect. 16 thou off the bat. Done. So number 11 is perfect. Number 12, no bueno.
This one is too much.
So the clearance is too tight in valve number 12. So we need to make a little adjustment. So if the clearance is too tight, we need to adjust by tipping the valve or by using a smaller shim. If the clearance is too large, the only option is to either use a bigger shim if possible, or by actually sinking the valve seat so that the valve stem protrudes higher up into the head. This by far involves a whole lot more work So I am lucky in this instance that the clearance is a bit too tight. Let's try in the first instance to swap out the shim with a smaller shim and see if I get lucky that way. Okay, so now I have to measure a shim, find one that is a couple thou thinner than the one that I used before, replace it into the assembly, measure the clearance again, and see if I'm on the money. So now I have to replace the shim in the assembly, replace the cam, and measure again to make sure, well, to see if I'm lucky this time around. Unfortunately, I'm not. It is still too tight of a clearance and I don't have any skinnier shims, so my only option is to remove the valve and tip it a bit. But from experience, I can tell that perhaps only a thou or so needs to be removed, a very, very small amount. So let's mount the valve on the fixture, put it in the jig, and take off one thou. There you go, just like that, a perfectly tipped valve. Now let's put it back in the assembly and see if we have the correct clearance that is required. Okay, let's measure again and see if we are at the clearance that we need. Yes, we're there. Just a light drag on the feeler gauge as it passes under the lobe. Double check from the other side. Perfect. So 2 valves completed, 22 more to go. I really hope you've learned something from this video. If so, please give us a like. Or also feel free to ask any questions that you might have in the comment section below. Thank you.